All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. I want to thank you for taking the time to come join us today as we discuss this important topic of IT complexity and how it affects cybersecurity. This webinar is the first in a two-part series, the second of which is going to take place next week, next Friday. And this session is meant to cover the topic of cybersecurity from a business lens. So whether you're a technology leader or a business leader, you're in the right place today. I'm Ernie Spence, a partner with Wilson Perumal Company, where part of my focus area is on human and organizational performance and operational excellence. We've designed this webinar to share our perspectives on IT complexity and cybersecurity, which you may find contrary to some of the traditional ways that we normally think about and discuss cybersecurity. This topic is focused on a big problem that we're all wrestling with. Despite the increased spending on global cybersecurity, over $220 billion last year alone, in 2023, we had nearly twice as many successful cyber attacks as the prior year. And the data show that the trend is only going from bad to worse. We need to stop. What we need to do is step back and understand the root causes of the cybersecurity attacks and what we need to do to actually make a difference. At the end of this hour, you'll leave here with a better idea of what's driving the increase in cybersecurity attacks, a different way to understand the true root causes of those incidences, and how business leaders need to be thinking about cybersecurity and the impact on business strategy. We've planned about 35 minutes for this webinar presentation and about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions that come up during the presentation or thoughts that you'd like to share, please put them in the Q&A chat box. We'll collect and queue the questions so we can answer them at the end. And if there are any questions that we don't have time to get to, we'll be sure to follow up with all the attendees afterwards. And we very much look forward to you sharing your thoughts on this topic. So we'll also be sending out a recording of the session along with the slides to all of our registered attendees over email over the next few days. So with that, let me introduce my colleague, Dean Hamilton, who will lead us through today's webinar. Dean is WP&C's Chief Technology Officer. He spent his career in the information technology industry. He has worked at, successfully founded, and led several technology companies, and he has long been an industry leader in the areas of technology and innovation. So, Dean, over to you.
Thanks, Ernie, and thanks again to everyone for joining. Before I start, let me just give you a quick word about me. As Ernie said, I'm the CTO at Wilson Perumal Company, which is a management and strategy consulting firm that specializes in helping clients tackle the adverse impact of complexity. And complexity, we believe, is having a major adverse impact on many businesses' strategy and operations. Now, I started my career decades ago as a Silicon Valley software engineer, and then as an engineering executive working for some pioneering companies in the early days of the internet. And then I had the good fortune to be able to start some of my own technology companies. And in 1997, I started a company called Cosine Communications, which built carrier-class networking hardware and software for telecommunications companies and internet service providers. And at Cosine, we developed cybersecurity offerings, such as firewalls and VPNs that used our own IPsec and MPLS technology. So I've been involved in the cybersecurity area for a long time. And this morning, I'm going to talk to you about cybersecurity from the perspective of something called Zero Trust Network Access, or ZTNA. And we're going to discuss why, if we're not careful, it may end up getting the same reputation as many digital transformations have. That is a failure. So let's go ahead and get started. You know, before we can fix a problem, I think we have to be willing to be honest about it. And Ernie kind of mentioned this in his opening. I think we have to start by admitting that the approach we've used to cybersecurity historically has failed. We see that the frequency of cyber attacks continues to grow rapidly. The financial impact is actually growing geometrically. And in 2023, defending the world against cybercrime cost us $223 billion. We're spending more and more of our IT dollars on cybersecurity, and we're actually getting less and less for it. So the path we're on is definitely not sustainable. And I know everybody's putting their hopes on AI these days. I would suggest to you that AI is likely to make the problem worse and not better. And at Wilson Perumal, we believe that IT complexity is a major cause of the failures that we're seeing, the failure to bend this cybersecurity risk curve down. Now, I've been growing increasingly concerned about our lack of understanding of how complexity is affecting cybersecurity risk. For instance, moving to the cloud. The cloud does provide some significant economic benefits, and everyone expected that migration to the cloud would actually improve cybersecurity. Turns out that hasn't been the case. It hasn't been the case because simplification unfortunately, hasn't been one of the benefits of the cloud. Instead, we've seen steadily, increasingly growing cloud complexity in the cloud. So now most cybersecurity breaches are actually connected to resources in the cloud. And at Wilson Perumal, we think this is actually to be expected because there's an undeniable link between IT complexity and cybersecurity risk. Now, have you noticed that IT vendors, and I feel like I can say this because I was a vendor for a long time, IT and cybersecurity vendors always promise that their new technology is going to make things simpler. In fact, at Wilson Perumal, we believe we're living in a new post-industrial age that is affecting all aspects of business operations. We like to call it the age of complexity. And we've dedicated our firm to helping clients thrive in this age. And that's why we've even written two books on this important subject. Now, studies have shown that complexity erodes human performance, which increases risk. So at Wilson Perumal, we've developed unique insights and strategies and tools to help our clients improve human performance. In the cybersecurity domain, everyone, as I said, is pinning their hopes on this shift to zero trust network access. But I've been worried that zero trust network access adds even more complexity without doing anything to help us cope with the debilitating complexity we already have. I've seen some early warning signs, some indications that ZTNA may be poised to become the latest victim of unaddressed IT complexity. So late last year, I commissioned the first study of its kind investigating that subject. And that study has validated my concerns. And we'll be releasing our complete report at the end of this month. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of this presentation. But I really wasn't surprised by what we found. We found that ZTNA is adding significant operational complexity to already overtaxed IT organizations. And we found that, contrary to popular expectations, completed ZTNA implementations actually result in significantly higher IT operational spending as a percentage of revenue. We also found that many ZTNA implementations are failing outright, and many more are what I call quietly failing. This happens when an implementation is abandoned, but it's left in place in an incomplete state. And the security risks of such incomplete implementations are often higher than if no implementation was ever started. We believe that the complexity involved in ZTNA transformations and the failure rate of these transformations are directly related. So what is it about complexity that makes it so risky for implementing ZTNA? And why can't we get a handle on it? Well, before I answer those questions, bear with me for a few minutes while I delve into complexity just a little bit before circling back to ZTNA. Now, cybersecurity and IT leaders aren't blind to the challenges posed by increasing IT complexity. Most of them intuitively understand what many studies confirm, that human-run processes in complex operational environments are more vulnerable to human mistakes. At Wilson Perumal, we actually have a name for this type of vulnerability. We call it an OEV, or an operations and execution vulnerability. And there are simply more operations and execution vulnerabilities in complex IT environments, and more of these vulnerabilities result in more critical operational mistakes. That's why 95% of cybersecurity incidents and breaches can be traced back to human mistake. And in the IT world, you'll hear a lot of talk about something called CVEs, or common vulnerabilities and exposures, which are flaws in IT software that increase cybersecurity risk. But unfortunately, we hear nothing about OEVs. Yet it's these operations and execution vulnerabilities that are at the root of most of our cybersecurity failures. But what's even more troubling and even less well understood is how our natural reactions to these challenges actually make them worse. For instance, our natural reaction, our natural human tendency when we're faced with something complicated or complex is to narrow our focus, is to zoom in. We want to naturally break the complex thing into smaller components so we can simplify the problem space. That's a perfectly reasonable reaction. And then when we find areas where humans are making mistakes because of these operations and execution vulnerabilities, we then try to eliminate or limit the human involvement, often by automating the problem. Now, as I said, these are perfectly reasonable and even helpful reactions when dealing with complicated systems. But unfortunately, they don't work well for solving problems in complex systems. And our IT environments are complex systems. Folks, this is not just a semantic difference. Now, the truth is that we tend to use the word complex when we really mean complicated. So what's the difference? Well, the behavior of complicated systems can be completely understood by breaking them down into their individual parts and the interactions between those parts. The behavior of complicated systems is usually linear and deterministic and can be reliably modeled. Because of this, complicated systems can be highly automated. Take modern rockets and spacecrafts as a great example of complicated systems. But these systems can be flown almost entirely with automation. Now, the behavior of complex systems is very different. They can only be understood by looking at the system as a whole. Complex systems can appear to behave in a chaotic manner. In a complex system, making a small beneficial change in one area might actually create an unforeseeable, huge adverse change in another area. And while complex systems can be modeled, especially using modern AI technologies, the fidelity of that modeling often isn't very high. So modeling these systems can provide a false sense of security. A global business supply chain is actually a good example of a complex system that many businesses depend on. And such a system has many interdependencies that are difficult to model. Think about the economic factors, the political factors, the health events, weather, transportation, labor disputes. All of these interact with each other. Think about how well your supply chain models, your global supply chain models did in the pandemic. So you shouldn't rely on automating a complex system. You can have automation, but you shouldn't rely just on that. If you do, you're going to be ill prepared to deal with the risks of these systems. Now, why does this matter? Because you need different tools to successfully manage risk in a complex environment. Now, IT environments are not just any complex systems. They are a specific type of complex system called a socio-technical system. A socio-technical system has many critical human and technology interdependencies that can't be eliminated. And IT environments have a large number of these human dimensions that are critical to the success of the system. For instance, their goals and policies and organizational structures and processes and culture. These are all critical to getting the most out of the technical components of your IT environment. Now, in socio-technical systems, human unpredictability is often the biggest contributor to risk. In fact, the more human dimensions you have in a socio-technical system, the more unpredictably it's likely to behave. So IT leaders can be forgiven for trying to automate the humans out of the loop. But as we discussed already with the supply chain example, complex systems actually need human intuition and judgment. But that's not even the whole story. You see, IT environments are also highly dynamic. They're highly dynamic, complex socio-technical systems. In IT environments, the technology itself is constantly changing. Often the IT staff is in frequent flux, and the adversarial threats to the system are changing extremely rapidly and in ways that are entirely unpredictable. And contrary to conventional wisdom, humans actually have significant advantages in this type of system. The good news is that properly trained humans can reliably outperform machines in such dynamic, complex socio-technical environments. Machines are great at responding to threats that can be inferred from data that we've already seen. If we have sufficient data, we can use that to model even complex behaviors. And in those cases, machines will outperform humans. But we, as humans, we're designed to explore the unknown. We have the ability to reason better than machines about the risks we haven't encountered before. We're much better than machines at reasoning and making inferences with insufficient or incomplete data. We're also more creative. We're more creative and more adaptable than machines in dynamic and unpredictable situations. So we'll often make better decisions than machines when faced with the same information. This means that IT and cybersecurity leaders really should focus more on improving people and human processes in order to maximize their full potential. But that's not what we do. You know, for 30 years, for more than 30 years, since the dawn of the internet, we've used what I call the resistance-oriented philosophy for reducing cybersecurity risk and defending our IT systems. Our goal has been to create impenetrable cybersecurity defenses. And the whole philosophy has been based on the same two flawed underlying assumptions. One, we assume that cybersecurity risks can be fully understood and then mitigated by zooming in. And two, we believe that fewer human interactions with our IT systems are going to make us safer. These assumptions have led us to focus our energy and our capital on certain attributes and approaches. For instance, we endeavor to maximize the use of automation and minimize human interaction. And then where humans are needed, we try to constrain their behavior using training and policies and audits. And then we focus on identifying and correcting our failures. Now, this approach works well for complicated systems, but it's woefully insufficient for complex systems. And remember, we just learned that IT environments are complex systems. Now, at Wilson Perumal, we believe that a different philosophy is best suited for the IT domain and cybersecurity domains. It's a philosophy that focuses on resilience, both the resilience of the technology, environment, and architecture, and the resilience of the people and processes in that environment. It's a philosophy that doesn't assume that we can succeed in creating impenetrable defenses. Instead, it's anchored in very different underlying assumptions. First, we accept that we actually can't fully understand all the risks the system faces. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand them. But our best insight will come from trying to see the system as a whole, and there will always be gaps in that understanding. Second, we must realize and accept that humans are actually our best asset in such a situation. And we may have to focus on different attributes to maximize the potential of humans. And doing so then leads us to add a different set of approaches, a much more human-centric approaches to the ones we saw before. So in fact, we don't assume the supremacy of automation over people. We can use automation, but we realize that automation can't be entirely relied on. And even when it's used, its performance will only be as good as the people responsible for the automation. Second, we must defer in the final analysis to human expertise, human reasoning, insight, and judgment as a complement to our machine intelligence. Third, we should assume that even the best skilled and dedicated humans will make mistakes in the presence of these operations and execution vulnerabilities. So we have to focus on making our processes resilient in the face of human failure. In other words, any person should be able to make a mistake without a critical process failing. And finally, we should focus on our successes and learn from them as much as we learn from our failures. Now, this resilience-oriented philosophy has actually proven its value in other complex socio-technical and even highly dynamic domains that have had to deal with a very high consequence of failure, such as nuclear power and aviation, chemical manufacturing, and healthcare. And it has a lot of academic rigor behind it that proves its value. So now back to ZTNA. One of the biggest mistakes IT leaders make is thinking that zero trust network access is basically just a souped up VPN technology. Now, to be fair, you can deploy ZTNA as a replacement for your VPN, but then you're not really getting the full benefit of ZTNA. So I want to take a minute to examine why real ZTNA adds so much complexity. Before ZTNA, the job of cybersecurity defense was to keep the bad guys out of the safe network, the private network. If you're outside of the private network, the safe network, the secure network, we try to determine who you are before letting you in. That's the legacy approach. If we know who you are, then we can let you in. And then once you're inside our four walls of the safe network, we want to make it easy for you to move around the network because we want to make it easy for you to do your job. But if a bad guy gets through the front door, then they have free run of the place. The private network is a highly permissive environment in the legacy architecture. An IBM report says that in 2022, it took roughly 9 months from the time an intrusion occurred for the business to identify and report a data breach. Think about that. All that time, the cyber criminal is in your network, lurking, exploring other systems on the network and strategizing and planning how to maximize their impact. ZTNA does away with that model entirely. With ZTNA, there are no good guys and bad guys. There's no secure or safe network or unsafe network. There's no trusted and untrusted end user devices. The ZTNA paradigm says that trust is only extended pursuant to meeting the requirements of an explicit, highly specific security policy. That security policy doesn't just involve establishing your identity. It involves establishing what you're authorized to do in great detail. It also involves establishing what machines should your device be able to access for your role. What applications and application capabilities are you authorized for? Even what data you should be allowed to see. And you're only allowed to access a resource at the least privilege level necessary to perform your authorized business function. The policy, ZTNA policy, also takes into account what is the security posture of your device. For instance, is your antivirus turned on? What is the recent behavioral context of your device? Did your device's IP address suddenly move from California to China in the last hour? What is the macro threat environment the company is experiencing at the time you're trying to connect? Are we under attack? With ZTNA, no identity or device, even the CEO's identity and device, is trusted to connect to the network unless there is an explicit policy allowing that person and that device to access the resource they're trying to access, and all the requirements of the policy have been met. If some requirements aren't met, what should happen? Well, the policy defines that also. For instance, a finance leader might still be able to see banking account information, but may be restricted from authorizing transfers if some elements of the policy are not met. All of this trust is then continually and continuously evaluated even after you're granted access. and then access is revoked as soon as trust is compromised. So ZTNA moves us from a highly permissive networking environment to a highly restrictive one by defining these very specific, fine-grained policies. And you can see right away that this is a huge, huge shift. But perhaps you already can see too that as an architecture, you might have noticed that if this is done right, ZTNA is an inherently resilience-oriented architecture. The big benefit of ZTNA is that even if one system is compromised, there's no implicit trust allowing a malicious actor to compromise another system. And that means that even a small compromise is unlikely to become a big one. So folks, ZTNA holds the promise to dramatically reduce cybersecurity risk, even after a compromise occurs. Which all sounds fantastic until you realize how much effort it'll take to identify, define, and maintain highly specific ZTNA policies. Remember, with ZTNA, the default policy for access to any resource on a network is deny. In the absence of a policy, you have no access. In the purest ZTNA implementation, you should intentionally define and manage an explicit, detailed policy that addresses every combination of attributes we discussed on the last slide. The permutations get large and unwieldy really fast, even for a really small organizations. For example, imagine if you have a small end-to-end business process that requires interactions by people in 10 roles in your business. And those people are going to use two types of end-user devices. And they're going to interact with an application that supports 10 different role-based business process capabilities that application delivers. And at the end, and the end-to-end business process is supported by two enterprise business systems. And those business systems provide access to three levels of sensitivities of data. Well, you could have up to 1,200 specific ZTNA policies to develop and manage just for this use case. So you can immediately see that the most pure view, the extreme view of ZTNA is actually operationally impractical. From a practical perspective, there will have to be some policy definitions that apply to less specific groupings of people and groupings of IT resources. In other words, there will have to be some broader zones of trust that are specified at a higher level than the most atomic policy attributes that ZTNA allows. And there's the rub. Practical ZTNA requires compromise. And making the right compromises, in other words, finding the right equilibrium, is what will determine whether ZTNA helps you or actually hurts you. At Wilson Perumal, our research indicates that ZTNA is just as likely to impair your business and increase your cybersecurity risk as it is to improve it. Why? Well, every organization must find a way to experimentally calibrate their ZTNA policy specificity to the unique realities and constraints of their business. There is really no out-of-the-box ZTNA that is going to be perfect for your business, no matter what the vendors tell you. So getting ZTNA right is as much a strategy exercise as it is a technology exercise. And failure to recognize this can create two important problems. If the policy specificity or the scope of trust is too broad, then there won't be enough cybersecurity friction for ZTNA to be effective. Poorly executed ZTNA is not much better than no ZTNA. On the other hand, if policy specificity is too narrow or too granular, your business processes and IT operations, the friction in those operations will overwhelm the capability of your organization, and you will also increase your risk. Let me use a couple of charts to illustrate what I'm saying here. So as ZTNA policy specificity increases, which increases cybersecurity friction, the probability of a cybersecurity incident starts to come down, which is a good thing, which is what we want. But as policy specificity increases, non-IT business friction is also increasing. And that green line doesn't keep coming down. In fact, that increased business friction incentivizes your IT end users to look for workarounds and shortcuts that end up increasing your cybersecurity incident probability. It's also true that every IT organization will have a point where ZTNA-related operations and executions vulnerabilities, those OEVs we talked about, start to overwhelm the ability of the people in the IT organization to manage those policies effectively for the business stakeholders. Once again, the probability of an incident in that case will start to go up instead of continuing to come down. So an IT organization with it will need a new way of calibrating with the rest of the business in order to search, and collaborating with the rest of the business in order to search for an equilibrium point where the probability of an incident stops coming down, and where the probability of an incident stops coming down, and then to keep the policy specificity just to the left of that point, right? You want to increase your ZTNA policy specificity to the point where you can't get any more risk reduction, and then you want to stop before it starts turning in the other direction. Now, in any organization, if you want to bring that green line, and in this right-hand chart, the left-hand drawings are left-hand lines are now dotted. If you want to bring that green line, the probability of incidents line, down further, you're going to have to tackle the complexity-related factors that affect human performance. If you use the resilience-oriented philosophy to do so, your people will be better able to cope with the added business process and IT friction. In other words, the blue line will bend down. And when that happens, the green line, the incident probability line, automatically bends down too. And as a result, the equilibrium point where you can get to, that you can find before risk starts turning in the other direction, moves to the right. In other words, you're going to be able to get more cybersecurity effectiveness from ZTNA with the same team if you're using this resilience-oriented approach. And folks, this is not something anyone else out there is saying. You're certainly not hearing it from the ZTNA technology vendors or systems integrators. And that's why we at Wilson Perumal feel it's so important to bring this to the attention of business and IT and cybersecurity leaders. So what can be done about this? Well, I believe that every medium to large organization undertaking a ZTNA implementation needs a strategy partner with expertise in complexity and human performance optimization. At Wilson Perumal, we recommend a specific methodology for implementing ZTNA in a manner that results in what we call high reliability cybersecurity. So I want to unwrap that a little bit for you as we end here, and telling you a little bit about high reliability cybersecurity. Now, you can't develop ZTNA policies or high reliability cybersecurity practices for an entire enterprise all at once. You'll need to first build up a new capability and way of working that allows you to search for and find that equilibrium through experimentation. And so it's important to start in the right place. We suggest starting by identifying a business unit, a business function, and a few business processes that are at moderate cybersecurity risk as a starting point. And you'll start by assessing the maturity and the readiness of the cybersecurity, the IT, and the business teams that are supporting that area of the business. We've developed proprietary tools to help you assess your teams against the operational excellence and resilience standards that are used by high reliability organizations in the other domains I mentioned. The cybersecurity team that is supporting this area will take the lead. And they are going to become the anchor for your ZTNA pilot implementation. They will be the leaders for your ZTNA pilot implementation. And they will work with your strategy partner to first develop your ZTNA implementation strategy. The second thing you need to do is integrate that cybersecurity team to create a larger pilot team with representatives from the other business functions. So that team is going to need representatives from your IT stakeholders, the business process stakeholders, application and user communities, and your enterprise architectures team. And so what you're creating here is what we call a ZTNA pilot multifunctional capability team. This team will develop your experimental processes to rapidly iterate using agile methodology in order to quickly calibrate policy specificity and to business process friction. And they have to be highly responsive to each other in order to evolve quickly to mastery. But this team can't work on their own in an isolated bubble because complex environments require seeing the big picture. So your multifunctional capability team will develop and use an enterprise architecture model that will help them examine the external dependencies of the pilot domain on the other adjacent business processes. Your enterprise architecture team will lead your tabletop exercises to simulate the downstream impact of policy changes and then recommend operating model adjustments to reduce complexity and risk. Now, once the policy has been designed and that policy design is stabilized and the policies have been provisioned in your ZTNA technology platform of choice, you will then develop baseline operational runbooks. These runbooks define your operational processes for managing and maintaining your policies. You then have to take a look at those runbooks and identify what we call the OEVs, the operations and execution vulnerabilities. Right? These are the vulnerabilities to that process, the way it's designed, is going to these vulnerabilities are going to affect people's ability to operate those processes reliably. And then you're going to add procedural safeguards to mitigate those OEVs. And at the end of this step, you end up with a special type of runbook we call a high reliability cybersecurity runbook for ZTNA. And these runbooks assume that the OEVs will result in a human failure, and at some point, that failure the runbook has to address that failure and eliminate the dependency on any single human point of failure. Then you have to put in place an operational excellence management system, one that embeds the pillars of this high reliability way of working and high resilience way of working into the daily work practices and culture. And once you've done that, you're finally ready to go live with your pilot. Now, while your pilot is up and running, the strategy team will build out the enterprise roadmap. The multifunction capability team will incorporate the learnings that are coming back from the pilot into the runbooks. And once all of that has stabilized, using those, they will begin training other teams to execute using the learnings and the resources that were developed in the pilot. And we're highly confident that this approach allows ZTNA to deliver on its promise. ZTNA has this promise of resilience, but it also allows it to avoid the pitfalls that could cause your implementation to fail. So our next webinar, June 14th, Ernie Spence will take you through how to implement high reliability, which includes that focus on resilience into your ZTNA cybersecurity transformation. And while you're waiting for that next webinar, I want to invite you to take our free online cybersecurity operational excellence self-assessment. I know that's a mouthful. It's designed for IT and cybersecurity executives to help you gauge your maturity and your readiness to take on the complexity of ZTNA. And you can scan the QR code here, and we'll also send you the link separately. And before we go to our Q&A, this slide shows you the QR code for Ernie's presentation. Ernie's an expert in implementing the operational excellence principles and standards used to improve human performance in high reliability organizations. And Ernie's going to pick right up where I left off and tell you about how to turn your people into the most important assets of your ZTNA cybersecurity strategy. Finally, I want to invite you to check out the link to our upcoming ZTNA complexity report. This report will be available at the end of June, at wilsonparamount.com/ZTNA-complexity-report. And I believe all registered participants in this webinar series are going to get the full report, all of the findings, all of our analysis, and all of our recommendations. And so please go and check that out as soon as the report is available. And if you like this webinar, please share it on your social media so that we can broaden the reach of this message. And of course, we always welcome you to reach out to us directly at any time to talk to us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick, and let's see if we have time for a few questions, Nick.
Yes, Dean. So for a team in the middle of a ZTNA deployment, what do you recommend we do differently immediately?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you have to be careful if you're in the middle of a ZTNA deployment. You don't want to put it in hold and leave it in a kind of an unresolved intermediate state. But I think you should bring in a strategy partner. You still keep moving forward with the execution you're doing, but I think you bring in an outside organization with complexity expertise to take a look at the whole ZTNA implementation strategy and the execution so far, and identify the weaknesses, the areas where the strategy is lacking the ability to address the human performance and complexity issue. And then you'll have to design. Then you'll have to design a sort of a transitional plan. You don't want to stop entirely, but you do need to be able to slow things down, to pull up, and start to really think through carefully how you're going to design in this high reliability way of working, how you're going to build runbooks and formalize the operational kind of rigor that is going to be needed to be successful in a complex environment. So I think for every ZTNA deployment underway, how you do that is going to have to be carefully contextualized based on the organization and how far into their deployment they are. But we did something similar like this for the U.S. Army when it came to our firm did when it came to their ERP modernization strategy, which had started, but one of the senior generals responsible for it realized that there was a lot of risk and brought us in to take a look at it while it was sort of in flight, and we were able to come in very quickly and help them adapt and adjust the strategy to mitigate those risks.
And the next question is, why do you think human performance and resilient operations have not been the focus of IT operations historically?
Oh, I think because we as IT and cybersecurity people have always had a technological bias. Our bias has always been that better technology, more technology will solve the problem. And I know I've suffered from that bias as much as anybody else over the course of my career, right? We're going to build, some vendors going to build something smarter, simpler, more full-featured, that is going to address the pain that we're feeling. And we throw money, usually CapEx and sometimes OpEx, with services that we buy, technological cloud services and so on, at the problem, hoping that the next technical innovation will make all the difference in the world. I think that has proven itself not to be the case, and I think we need a major shift. But there is just a cultural bias in the kinds of people that we hire and who run our IT and cyber, these highly technologically oriented organizations.
And Dean, I would add, if you'll allow me,
Sure.
I think that's a real risk that is unrecognized and accelerating in its magnitude for leaders, business leaders today, because as we think about all that business friction, business process friction you talked about, for I think a lot of the organization, they're going to have, it's going to become, when ZTNA is in their area, it gets so much more difficult to just do your job. If they don't understand the technology, what it can and can't do, I think their tendency is going to be even more so than it is today, to just assume that it's working. But we always know the threat actors are trying to get in. They will figure out how to get around many of the policies that are being devised today. They'll find out new ways to attack. But you're also going to have, as you said, folks within the organization who are going to try to figure out how to undermine that so they can just do their job. They're well-intentioned. They just want to do their job. And if I'm one of those folks who just this is getting harder and harder to understand, I'm just assuming that it's working, I'm going to be even looking out for things that are not quite right, even more so than I would have been today. And I think it's going to breed complacency. I think it's going to cause a very strong sense of misplaced security around for a lot of folks, that the system is just working. And it's going to be even harder to recognize when things are not as they should, because things are changing so rapidly. So I think how many people are doing their jobs in a ZTNA environment compared to how they were doing them before. So I think it's a lot of risk for leaders to think about just the execution of the work that's going on around them with the technology systems.
Yeah, Ernie, great point. And I think this is all just, with the advent of generative AI and the hype and the mad rush to put AI into everything, what you just described is even more difficult for business leaders to really understand what's real and what's not, and what reduces risk and what increases risk and complexity. And unfortunately, a lot of businesses are only going to learn they were wrong when something terrible happens.
And Dean, building off that, we got another Q&A saying, you mentioned the trade-off between business agility and security is a business and IT decision that will require much closer collaboration between these two groups. How do you recommend that organizations build those mechanisms and systems to foster IT and business collaboration on these strategic issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Nick. And I don't think there's any sort of one-size-fits-all answer for how to make that collaboration effective. I think it has to be an experimental approach. So that's why this experimental pilot that allows you to build the muscles for experimenting with how to get the most efficient collaboration in your area of business between all of the parts of the business that are going to need to collaborate to get these these policies correct. There's going to have to be some trial and error there, and there's going to have to be willingness to try to sort of quickly tune what you and learn from our mistakes. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations are not good at that kind of agile experimental learning process across their organizational elements. So, but it can be done. And I think once one small team kind of figures it out and learns what are the right ways to sort of build the structures that then allow the best collaboration mechanisms to emerge. Once you learn how to do that, then you can teach other teams in other parts of the organization to do that, and they may have slightly different. They may end up with slightly different flavors of how to make that collaboration work. So each organization is going to have to sort of figure some of that out for themselves to end up in the best place, just like they're going to have to figure out for their part organization what's the best equilibrium point for that balance between cybersecurity friction and business friction. So it's going to be I wish I could say it was like, do this, here's the 5-step process. But it's a bit of an experimental process, I think, to get to the right answer on that question, Nick.
Perfect. And then the final question is, as a business leader, do I need to fully bother and understand ZTNA, or is it likely to be replaced by the next new thing in cybersecurity?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, I could just give you my opinion here. I think let me answer the second part of the question first. Is it likely to be replaced? I think ZTNA is going to be around for a long time. I think ZTNA as an architecture is attempting to do the right thing, right? Trying to move us to a place where there is no implicit trust. We question everything. And I think in a world where most of our employees are no longer in our 4 walls. They're working from somewhere else. It may be home or whatever. So it's a distributed workforce. And most of the services and the resources that we're accessing to do technical resources to do our jobs are also distributed. They're not sitting in 1 or 2 big data centers somewhere, but there are other service providers in the cloud and so on. I think in this architecture, ZTNA makes a whole lot of sense. And my guess is it's going to be around for a long time. Now, if we see some big fundamental change in how networks and IT services are structured, if we move suddenly, the cloud and all this distributed services went away and we now start moving to something completely new, and I don't know what that would be yet. Then there might be some new flavor of ZTNA or something that's necessary. But I think ZTNA as a sort of an architecture will be around for a long time. And so to the first part of your question, do business leaders need to understand it? I do think they need to understand it. And that doesn't mean sort of getting down in the weeds with the detailed, technological aspects of each kind of ZTNA enablement technology, but they do need to understand in broad strokes what ZTNA is, why it's good, and what it does for them to provide, how it accomplishes that good, to provide the benefit, also can hurt them. I think that's what we've tried to address here. And I think that discussion is one that business leaders should be having. They shouldn't be just saying, well, we need ZTNA. The White House is talking about ZTNA. CISA is talking about ZTNA. Everybody's saying we should do ZTNA. Go and do ZTNA. We gotta say, what does ZTNA mean to my business? How can I make sure that ZTNA is providing the benefit and not doing harm? And that's the job of business leaders, not just IT and technology leaders.
Yeah, and Dean, I would also add, back to that question you just answered around how do we drive the right collaboration between IT and business leaders? You can't have it if the business leaders aren't going to be knowledgeable enough to collaborate meaningfully with the technology and security leaders around how the various aspects of cyber, ZTNA, but the other cybersecurity programs that exist, how they affect their business area, how it affects operations, how people are going to be using and interacting with them. Those are all conversations that have to be made. And as a business leader, if I'm not at least versant in what's happening on the technology side, I don't know how I can be an effective collaborator to solve this real world business problem.
Great point, Ernie. And it's not just ZTNA that's come into the sort of the pantheon of cybersecurity technologies, or technologies like secure web gateways and secure service edge, SSE, and there are all these new technologies that all have value and all add complexity to the landscape. And business leaders need to just not hear these acronyms and say, go do that, but they need to understand what they mean, because they're all kind of double-edged swords. They add some value and then they come with some risks. Perfect.
And that concludes our Q&A portion of today's webinar. I'll hand it over to Ernie Spence for closing remarks.
Great. Thank you, Nick. And also thank you, Dean, for a wonderful presentation, very instructive and informative. I appreciate everybody who's attended and the comments and questions that you've left for us. So we will be sharing out the slides and the recording from the session over the next few days to the email addresses you use to register for the session. We also want to encourage you to visit our website, take that free self-assessment for ZTNA readiness that Dean talked about, and then also sign up to get a copy of the ZTNA report when it comes out here later this month. So thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.
Thanks, everyone.